Good afternoon and welcome back to the Atlantic Council IMF World Bank Week. I'm Josh Lipsky, Senior Director of the Atlantic Council's GeoEconomics Center, and I am very pleased to be joined by my colleagues, the distinguished Senior Fellows of the GeoEconomics Center, Jeremy Mark, Nicole Golden, Hung Tran, Martin Mulheisen, for our eighth version, I believe, if I'm counting correctly, of Decoding the IMF's World Economic Outlook, Decoding the WEO. The whole purpose of this event, the reason we've done it, and we appreciate everyone who comes in person and participates online, is to take this complicated and important economic document that the IMF spends months producing and help explain to you from the inside of those who have worked on it before what's in and what it means and what's left out and why it's left out. The decisions that are made in the process of what goes in the WEO are incredibly important. There's money that transmits all around the world based on it. Some of the best economists in the world work on it. And so our goal over the next hour is to parse it and truly decode it. So what we're going to do is turn to each fellow for their key themes and takeaways. I'll have a few questions for them, and then we'll turn to the group here for your questions. Hung, let me start with you.
Thank you very much, Josh, and I'm very pleased to join the 8th edition of our decoding session. WEO this year has a very nice subtitle, entitled Steady but Slow, Resilient and Divergence, which in my view summarize the themes of the WEO very nicely. Steady but slow, the global economy will grow 2.3% last year, this year, and next year, so steady, but lower than historical rates from a historical point of view. The reason for the slowdown is really deeply structured in the economy, including aging of the population, over-indebtedness, and most recently, GeoEconomic fragmentation. So they are difficult to reverse. So that is steady but slow. Resilient means in the US in particular, driven by retail consumption, growth has been resilient and strong. They upgrade the US growth to 2.7%. And in the press conference, the Counselor of Economics and Chief Economist referred to that as overheating. So overheating at 2.7% is something to ponder. However, that compensate the downgrade in Europe 1% for this year, 1.1%. The divergence refer to low-income countries, basically the main and big losers since the COVID and the Russian invasion of Ukraine. The IMF estimated that about $3.3 trillion of global output has been lost compared to the pre-COVID trend, and the low-income countries suffer the most. They lost 7 percentage points of their output since 2000. They are further behind in their conversion effort with the more developed countries. They have high debt. They have very high interest payment, 14% of their budget or more. So basically, on top of that, they now face sustained high petroleum oil prices and strong dollars because of the fact that the US will keep high interest rates for a longer time to come. Those two new things compared to when the WEO was written and approved have not, in my view, fully incorporated in the assessment, and therefore the risk for the LLC to fall further behind and really lacking the global economy is very severe in my view and not fully reflected yet.
Thank you. I'm glad you brought up the U.S. overheating point. We're going to talk about that the IMF's chief economist, Pierre Olivier, made that comment. It was an interesting choice of words. Obviously, U.S. growth very strong, but overheating is a specific term to use. And as you said, 3.2, 3.2, 3.2, steady as she goes. And you can feel a tension in the WEO. I think people might have seen this in Kristalina Georgiev's curtain raiser speech last week, which she gave right here at the Atlantic Council. The top line number is good, but they are so concerned about what's underneath that number and the divergent growth theme the IMF is hitting very hard. Don't be distracted by that strong US number. Look at the rest of the world and all the problems that are fractured underneath the foundation. Martin, over to you.
Thank you, Josh. It's great to be back here for the purpose of the discussion of the WEO and the GFSR and flagships. I'm focusing a bit more on the decoding part, which is always the interesting thing, because after all, it's a multilateral international institution that can't say things as they would like to sometimes. But I was glad to see this year that, or at this report, this half year, that the report seemed to be finally more outspoken on specific country issues that are important and also on certain policy measures. That impression that I have comes predominantly from the blog that accompanies the WEO's release. I would recommend you all to focus on the blog. The reports tend to be a little more dense and not as widely read, but they have a way now of kind of centralizing the messages there. And I think this year's or this spring's was really well done. Clearly, the IMF is concerned about the US fiscal deficit. But when you look, there's a very interesting table that shows how many countries are actually away from and a good deal away from stabilizing their debt ratios, even by 2029, let alone in they were before, in 2019 or so. So the fiscal situation is quite tense in many countries, and something needs to be done. The fiscal monitor reinforces that message, of course. But it's also interesting that the fiscal monitor itself has a table that shows that during election periods, fiscal consolidation is not exactly what you should expect from countries. So in a way, they kind of seem to realize at the fund that, well, yeah, we have to say it, but we realize it's not going to happen. And we'll come to the downside risks in a second. What's also interesting to see is, again, in the blog, you have a nice chart there, the diverse set of monetary policy pressures that countries face. So clearly in the US, you have very strong demand. You don't really have much of an output gap at the moment because the labor market is quite tight. But the situation is different in Europe, where there's a bit more of an output gap and maybe inflation pressures are not as high. And then they also look at Japan and China, and especially China, in principle, would have quite some room to stimulate the economy, as we, I think, all know. Now, what's also interesting, once you get away from the macro, I mean, you would expect the usual kind of drink or eat your cereal in the morning recommendations for structural reforms, but Gorincha's blog seems to focus on institutions and central bank independence this year, which is quite telling, because we have elections and we have certain populist groups, antiportas, if you want, both in Europe but also here in the US. It could be quite important elections, and I think they're right to warn that institutions are worth preserving, and that the impact of populist policies, and there's a couple of papers that came out, for example, in the NBER and others, they tend to be quite negative for growth and stability. So I think, obviously, the IMF can't be political, but focusing on institutions, central bank independence, among others, will be important, and I would recommend that they do that also in the October issue, which obviously then may be more politicized, but it reminds me of the Brexit debate, when the IMF and others came out strongly warning about the economic consequences of it, which in hindsight we've all seen playing out in the UK. So coming to an end, they're talking about trade, they're talking about the balance of risks. Risks, they say, seem balanced, in fact, not too much biased in either direction. I tend to disagree, but we can save that for the next round. And just as an aside, the Global Financial Stability Report doesn't seem too phased about financial risks at the moment. They're focusing mostly on the delayed effects of monetary tightening in commercial real estate, and of course on emerging markets, debt sustainability. But I think that there is some more risk in the asset markets, which tend to be quite richly valuated at the moment, and any sharp reversals, including in bond markets, could cause quite some distraction. So that's my kind of initial impression of the decoding part. Looking forward to more. Thank you.
Martin, thank you. And, there is a bit of a disconnect. We've talked about it before in these sessions. The WEO is put together over months, finalized weeks ago. And so when you think of what happened over the weekend, Iran strike on Israel, and then just over the past few days, some geopolitical shocks, we have the announcements this morning about President Biden wanting to triple steel and aluminum tariffs. These are things that are not factored into the WEO, but can sometimes feel discordant to the tone of the WEO. So we'll talk about a little bit. Nicole.
Great, thank you. And I'd first like to associate myself with Martin's comments about the blog. I agree, and all the chapters also have their own blogs, which are good. And there's videos now as well, so you can consume your information graphically, audibly, however you like it. So it's great to be here. This is actually my first time on this side of the table. As a decoder.
We're honored to welcome the bank's perspective to the fund's WEO.
Thanks.
It's good to have a fresh voice.
Well, thank you all. But, just kind of picking up on some of the comments that Hung and Martin have made and adding some. On that note, coming a little bit from the other side of 19th Street, I tend to focus a little bit more on what's happening in the EMDEs and the emerging markets and developing economies, and within that, in particular, the lower income economies. And as Jeremy and I were just talking before we started, what's interesting to me is while the sort of overall headline does speak to the scarring effects that we're seeing in the lower income countries, the divergence, they are on the sort of downside, if you will, of the divergence, slower growth, the higher debt levels, again, worse levels, worse impact than expected by the pandemic and the fallout from the pandemic, whereas, the richer countries, better than expected fallout. But at the same time, there's not as much actual narrative on the page, and perhaps that's because a lot of the data and the graphics unfortunately, speak for themselves when it comes to the low-income countries. I was struck by, believe it's chart 1.2, but sort of early on in the report, there's a series of charts, and it's all of the macro indicators: inflation, employment, labor force participation, capital accumulation, and a number. And almost universally, for all of the income groups except the low-income countries, they're in the black, so to speak, with the exception of China on employment and labor force participation, which I'm sure we'll come back to. But then you have the low-income countries, and they're on, again, their numbers are in the red, so to speak, on all counts. And again, it's very glaring, especially to somebody that's, thinking about these issues. And I think one of the things that's sort of underestimated in that, and I'm sure Jeremy has thoughts on this, is again, the impact that these, the weaknesses in the lower income countries, and to some extent in some of the other EMDEs, does actually have on the richer economies or the advanced economies. So I think, there's that issue that I think we need to be more aware of. There is the, attention to debt and the downside risks. One thing that I will say is, and I've talked about this before, is obviously the discussion of debt is focused on sovereign debt, which is the bigger issue, which is not the bigger issue, but the sort of headline issue that we've been talking about in many circles, and we should be continuing to talk about, but not discussed, at least in the WEO, but it is raised to a certain degree in the GFSR when it talks about private credit, which is business debt, corporate debt, and in particular, small, medium-sized enterprise debt and the risk associated with that for growth. So that's something maybe we can pick up on. One of the other interesting points to Martin's point about what seeing maybe some more bold comments than we've seen before in thinking about and talking about the risks. If you've heard me comment in WEO sessions before, I'm always the one raising my hand and saying, why aren't we talking about inequality? And in this case, they're not only the divergence, so the inequality between countries is something that is discussed more within the report to some extent. But in talking about that, some of those political risks, in talking about the electoral risk, there is attention paid to, and there is some voice at least given in the discussion of risk to inequality within the countries and to what happens when you don't have inclusive growth and what the relationship is. And they point to some of the data that shows that that can actually fuel conflict and fragility within countries. And that, of course, as we know, has no borders. I actually think I'm kind of with Martin that the balance of the risks is maybe a little optimistic. I think there's, again, speaking to what Josh, you were just saying, that not necessarily everything is accounted for in real time. And I think if they were rewriting the WEO today, there might be a little bit of a heavier tilt towards the downside. And then just the last thing I'll say for now, and then pick up on some things, is that in looking at the recommendations, again, the sort of usual things, I was surprised given, again, the attention to debt and the lack of fiscal space. There was not necessarily attention on the recommendation side to the domestic, what we think of as domestic resource mobilization, and what are some of those kind of policy types of reforms that both structurally in the labor markets, which do come up elsewhere, that can help create that fiscal space and help countries kind of build those fiscal buffers from within, that can go a long way to the resilience and on some of the debt fragility side. I'll stop there for now and look forward to the rest of the conversation. Thanks.
Thanks, Nicole. No, I'm glad you brought up the issue on LICs. I mean, Kristalina, when she was here, talked extensively about divergence. But then I think there's a fair point. Is there enough analytical work in the reports that back up the issue of divergence and what to do about it? Jeremy, I'm going to turn to you. I was going through, our team helped me go through the revisions in the WEO. It's always interesting to see who gets upgraded and downgraded. Russia, major upgrade, plus 2%, the largest upgrade of any G20 economy. US, major upgrade. But in the top 5, China. China, one of the largest upgrades in this WEO compared to the October version. We just had the Q1 data come out, surprisingly strong. Your view on China's economy and how it stands in the WEO?
I think that the upgrade is, the number itself is more significant than what's actually going on in the Chinese economy. That upgrade largely reflects this massive amount of capital that's going into manufacturing, and the wave of exports that is building right now. We can get to this in a moment. If you look further, you see that China, while they see 5.2% growth this year, they're projecting 5.2% last year. They're still projecting 4.6% this year and 4.1% in 2025. And the point is that they're really concerned that China is not addressing two issues. One is the property crisis, which has really decimated a lot of portions of the economy. They've not addressed the collapse of many major multi-billion-dollar developers, for example. They've done very little to give assurance to homeowners that their prices are going to be sustained in the medium term. But also, they take China to task for its failure so far to take steps to boost domestic demand, and without which the only leg they have to stand on is exports. And this is going to be a major problem. Now, having said that, that's sort of what they recommended. There's also what they would have liked to have recommended and what they failed to mention that in the WEO, and this is sort of decoding. There was a box toward the end of Chapter 1, basically with the exciting titles of scenarios that increase uncertainty about the WEO baseline. And this is what I call the core risks that we were too scared to mention for fear of upsetting powerful members.
Can we just say inside baseball right here on the IMF? Internally, we used to call these exploding boxes. These are boxes you tuck way down in Chapter 1 that are really interesting, but you hope reporters don't notice. So to the reporters listening, now we've uncovered.
I think last year I mentioned that there was a mea culpa box on how they sort of missed the downturn after COVID. So anyway.
I still learned something about the communications department even after I left the IMF.
I'm seeing various veiled threats there, but anyway. So how does it pertain to China? They have the recommendations about these risks of property market and such, and then in the box, they have a discussion of deflation in China and the potential of negative impact this could have on global activity. And they make it sound like this is something that could happen and we should be worried about. And the reality is it's going on right now. Just yesterday, Xi Jinping felt the need in meeting with the German chancellor to defend China's wave of exports by saying we are helping to reduce global inflation. Meanwhile, Janet Yellen last week was calling China out for the supply shock of artificially low-cost Chinese exports. So in other words, something that they're seeing sort of outside the baseline is happening right now, and it is going to be building in the coming months into possibly the central issue in China's tensions with the G7 at the very least. So it's a bit odd to see them kind of putting it to the side. That's what they could have recommended or should have recommended. And then there was that which was not really discussed. There's a very interesting chapter 3, called Slowdown in Medium-Term Growth, What Will It Take to Turn the Tide? Which is, I think, one of the more interesting chapters I've seen in the WEO in a long time, in which they're sort of talking about what was the long-term scarring effect of the global financial crisis continuing through COVID, and then what is building post-COVID. The bottom line being that there's a significant and broad slowdown, as they call it, in total factor productivity growth, which is to say misallocation of capital and labor, slower technology developments that could stimulate higher productivity, and generally less efficient use of inputs. And the bottom line for them is that global growth by 2030 will average about 2.8% a year versus pre-pandemic 3.8%, which doesn't sound like a lot. But if you're talking about global growth, 1 percentage point is actually a huge amount of lost output. And they run through all of these issues and what can be done. Demographic change is very important, shrinking labor forces throughout the world, but they don't talk about China in this context. And if you were looking for the poster child of all of these issues, misallocation of resources, misuse of labor, the impact of a rapidly aging workforce and society, that's China. And yet they don't go there. And then they make their usual, the standard IMF recommendations about various kinds of reforms, structural reforms. Of course, labor market flexibility is built in there, all of these issues. And you look at what China's doing, and China is dispensing with all of that and going with a state-led approach in which resources are being funneled into very specific technologies, green technologies, advanced semiconductors, and other things, with the hope that the massive use of resources in specific areas will help to overcome this decline in total factor productivity growth. And of course, the IMF analysis is that the worst thing you can do is undercut the private sector in seeking to address these issues, which is exactly what Xi Jinping has been doing. And it would have been nice if the WEO had touched a little bit on China in this context.
Hong, I'm going to go to you in a moment. But Nicole, did you want to jump in on chapter 3? Because I know we had talked about that before.
Sure, absolutely. So chapter 3 definitely caught my attention as well, and thought it was, incredibly interesting. I think one of the things that really jumped out to me, which Jeremy just mentioned, is the recognition that, so chapter 3, sorry, just to remind everyone, is about the middle term, so a 5-year growth trajectory or lack thereof, and the concerns that on current pace, we're looking at sort of the lowest 5-year growth trajectory in decades. And so one of the things that they speak about, one of the causes of this, is demographic pressures. Many of you that will be familiar with my work will know that that's one of the things that keeps me up at night, so to speak. It keeps me going. And if I may make a quick plug for our events this week, I'll be talking about realizing demographic dividends to inclusive growth with colleagues from the World Bank and IMF live at our studio at the IMF on Friday at 12:15. Small plug. But I was glad and somewhat surprised to see it in the WEO, and it is the story of kind of total factor productivity and labor force participation. And to that point, I think getting back to some of the recommendations, again, it was interesting for me to see really a lot of what we think of as the development reforms and kind of policies and programs, if you will, making themselves known, whether that's human capital, education and skills, increasing women's economic empowerment in particular for labor force participation. I saw a mention of things like, the care infrastructure and, providing childcare so women can get back to work. So I think there's even more kind of, space for that. But that, I thought Chapter 3 was, quite interesting in that regard. I failed to miss the miss on China, but I'm glad we have, Jeremy to correct us all. So, happy to continue talking about that.
Thanks, Nicole. Hung, I want to turn to you on commodity prices. I think this is something you wrote about yesterday in our live blog. For those who've been following, you can find it on the Atlantic Council page. We're doing analysis throughout the day as the reports and events come out. But the commodity prices are projected to fall in this WEO by nearly 10% in 24, oil down about 2.5%. Again, back to what I said at the beginning, calculations finalized a few weeks ago. I think any of us understanding what's happened in the world in the 3 weeks since would understand that projection feels overly optimistic.
Thank you, Josh. But if you allow me, before I answer your question directly, I would like to say a few words on China. My personal take, which might be differing from my colleagues, is that the think tank community here in Washington, IMF, even Janet Yellen, have engaged in wishful thinking when it comes to China, in my view. China's model has always been, since Mao Zedong, Deng Xiaoping, Jiang Zemin, Hu Jintao, and now Xi Jinping, has been constant, steady, the same. That is state-led intervention in the economy, state-guided investment in the manufacturing. That is their model. They will not change. And therefore, all the wishful thinking about, you should reduce or get away from state-led investment because it is inefficient and invest more in consumption ain't going to happen. Instead, the WEO should really analyze how the rest of the world can live with China the way it is, not the way they want it to be. And I think that is surely missing not only the WEO, but in our think tank community here as well. So I think that's one point that I want to raise. On commodities, again, if you look at the averages, commodities, it tells a different story. But for me and for the low-income countries, two things is important: oil price, food price, because these countries suffer most in terms of deficiency in energy and food security. And right now, because of geopolitical events impacting on the price of oil, the Middle East tension, and the war in Ukraine impacting the shipment of grain, those two items are extremely volatile in the past few years, impacting the LSE the most. Because basically at the moment we have, since the beginning of the year, oil price rising by more than 12%, because it is from $80 a barrel to close to $90. The dollar has been strengthening, basically 14-15% since the low in 2021. The combination of those two, not one, but combination of those two, will hurt the LIC significantly because they have to buy oil with dollars from their domestic currency, which they have to spend more and get cheaper, more expensive oil. And I think that comes on top of the problem they have suffered since COVID. So I think that is a very dire situation for the LIC.
Yes, I mean, if one of the themes of the WEO is divergent growth, it could look worse. If you were to reforecast this right now based on where commodity prices are likely.
Well, we will meet again 6 months from now to do all the decoding, and my personal betting is that they will revise in the October WEO a lot of the downside risk for
a lot
LIC.
of downgrades.
Yeah.
Okay, we'll watch for that.
And just remember, I mean, the food and fuel prices have been part of the story that have been, again, if we want to look at some of the emerging market and low-income countries, that, food and fuel inflation in particular, and fertilizer for that matter, have been a big part of the debt and the food insecurity story as well that have, been driving a lot of that.
Martin, let's go back to the U.S. You flagged this in your opening, get your fiscal house in order, clear message. Curious on the timing, you raised this in your opening because the next WEO, we'll have the WEO update in the summer, but the full WEO will come out 2 weeks before the election. And I'm sure that's something everyone's thinking about. So the timing's important here. But also struck, as Hung mentioned, this word overheating that Pierre-Olivier said in the blog. Obviously, U.S. economic growth strong. Is the U.S. economy actually overheating? Is that the right word to use?
No, I mean, with the overheating, what you usually mean is that inflation is kind of, I mean, labor markets are not only tight, but wage growth is strong and inflation goes up and the like. Now we're having, if you want, we're having a little bit of a warming again of the rather than overheating of the U.S. because inflation is kind of not declining further as some had hoped. It's kind of stubborn, although maybe the medium trend is still downward. But I mean, the issue is, yes, fiscal policy will not adjust this year, possibly not even next or the next couple of years. But that's a broader issue. I mean, I said earlier that I don't think the risks are really balanced as the report puts it. And why is that? The broader issue is that the geopolitical game that's going on right now puts the US and Europe and its democratic allies, Japan and so forth, in a way in the defensive, right? Because the certainties that existed for a long time after the Cold War ended, the way the international communities would behave, the lack of heavy military conflict in the middle of Europe, all these certainties are out the window. And now the democracies, the Western democracies, are under strain from aging, from, in some countries, low productivity growth. I'm talking about Europe here. They now face the fiscal costs of supporting allied countries, supporting their own rearmament, and of dealing with populist pressures that make it very difficult to cut anything like, benefits, which is the biggest budget item for many advanced economies, let alone other programs. In fact, the opposite is true. Plus, we have a huge migration wave in many countries that puts enormous pressure on more local finances. So I don't see how a major fiscal reform program can get underway to kind of rectify these problems over the medium term. Maybe after the elections this year, maybe some countries will make it. I mean, my home country, Germany, if you look at the tables in the blog that I mentioned, they're actually looking pretty good, but it comes at a cost, and Europe feels the cost of German fiscal adjustment. In fact, one of the interesting kind of risks in the WEO, and let me turn to those now, the downside risk is that Europe could engage in disruptive fiscal adjustment and debt distress. And they come with examples from the around 2015 and the like, where they felt that Europe has adjusted too fast and too quickly. So here's again yet another limiting factor of, well, be careful how you consolidate, do it gradual. But I don't think right now there is any room for gradual fiscal policies, quite frankly, because there's a lot of quick reactions to all sorts of things that are going on. We talked already about commodity prices and the list of risks that they have. I mentioned the delayed effects of tightening, that's in the GFSR. They also talk about China's recovery faltering. And I agree that there could have been more the protectionist pressures that kind of are being put on other countries. The exchange rate, as far as I could see, is strangely absent, at least in terms of headline status. But there will be another report coming out in June or July, the so-called external sector report. And, if there are these pressures that China is exporting in terms of deflation, then they should also show up in real effective exchange rates and the like. And I would be looking forward to that report. I mean, it seems if China continues with its policies, and I agree that they're not going to be stopped by appeals from the IMF or other countries, if China continues, we may well experience another episode of global current account imbalances, and that puts the IMF in the crosshairs because they're supposed to call out countries for that, and the US will react. In fact, President Biden already has reacted, as became clear this morning. Now, there's a lot of very concrete downside risks in the WEO. I think they're very real. They have been certainly exacerbated by the military events between Israel and Iran. It's a new normal. I think we should continue to expect more of these kind of shocks. But what are the upside risks that the WEO is talking about? What balances out all these negative scenarios that we're facing? Well, the first is something that is most likely happening. It's going to be a short-term fiscal boost in the context of elections. That's a first upside risk. That's a very short-lived upside risk. In a way, it contradicts their central message. And yes, it will.
Upside risk, by the way, one of the great macroeconomic terms
Yeah,
that an English language professional can
That's
ponder
right.
over for you.
So-
Upside risk.
Yeah, but that's a very short-term upside risk, if you ask. They talk about further supply-side surprises. So maybe there's less profit taking by enterprises and the like. This seems very much like an inflation miracle that they expect to happen. And I don't want to be too cynical about that. I mean, it's very difficult to concretize some of these risks. I want to give my former colleagues really a pass on that one. But what we have observed is a very quick decline of inflation, faster than expected. So are there some factors that it might continue? Perhaps. But it's just very difficult to write it down and be specific about it. But it's an upside risk, as they say. And then we have, of course, the reference to AI and how it could help productivity. And then couldn't it be that the structural reform momentum is gathering steam? Well, I was talking about populists earlier. So I don't see these upside risks quite as having the same weight as on the downside, and therefore I'd be a bit concerned. One word at the end on low-income countries. I think, and we may perhaps disagree slightly on that, I think it's right that the WEO and GFSR focus really on the globally important economic risks. I don't want to downplay the things that are going on in low-income countries. They're very important, but let's focus on the global economy. That's the fund's main responsibility, global financial stability. And we can argue whether the low-income countries deserve a bigger share of the discussion in that. But I also want to point out, and maybe we should include that in further discussions, because the IMF has a very interesting and long report on low-income and developing countries that just came out on April 2nd. In a way, it's the unofficial WEO for low-income countries, if you want, and maybe for one of the future rounds, we should actually focus on that, because that gives these countries the space that they deserve. Don't get me wrong on that one. But the fund's responsibility really is toward the global economic stability. I think with that, I'm going to give it back to you.
Martin, thank you. And by the way, I just want to point out the chart you referenced, the fiscal adjustment chart. It's on page 17 of Chapter 1. It's worth looking at. And it goes through 2010 to 2015 in the euro area and the missed forecast and the actual versus. It's one of the best charts, I think, of the WEO. Hung, I know you wanted to jump in. Then I have a final round for the group, and then we're going to open it up to the audience for questions.
Yeah. Thank you. Just want to pick up on the low-income countries remark that Martin said. I don't disagree with my colleague here. Economically, low-income countries constitute a very, very tiny portion of the global GDP. Africa, big continent, account for 2.7% of global GDP. So what happens there really has very negligible impact on the global aggregate GDP prospect. That's correct. However, what happens there will fuel waves of immigrants, economic immigrants, war immigrants running from war and destruction and lack of job, and so on and so forth. We all pay the price in this country and in your country, Germany. So I think if you really like a comprehensive picture, connect all the dots, then even though LIC is a small part of the economic pie, they occupy a very important part in the social stability of the globe. Not just economic stability, but social stability.
Great point. Jeremy, you wanted to jump in?
Yeah, just to expand upon Hong's point, we're looking at a global population that's rapidly aging in most regions. The World Bank put out a report at the beginning of the week called The Great Reversal about the scarring effects of COVID in low-income countries. And they said that 92% of the world is part of this sort of aging process. But it's Africa and other low-income countries where the young people are. And there's a great deal of discussion of demographic dividend constantly been talking about these regions, that this is where the energy will come from for the global economy if policies are handled right. But we're talking about less watched reports along with the LIC report. There, of course, the regional economic outlooks. And a few years ago, the Africa Department at the IMF devoted a paper to the demographic dividend, in which they made it very clear that, yes, there's an upside, but the downside is very real. And that if we fail to address the growth issues of this small percent of the global GDP now, if we fail to address the needs of the young people there will be no demographic dividend.
Nicole, I want to turn to you to respond to that, and then we haven't talked about the bright spot in the global economy other than the U.S., which is India. Kristalina talked about this. This is 7.8% growth in 2023, 6.8 for 24, 6.5 in 25. I mean, thinking of countries that are supporting global economic growth, India is at the top of the list now, not China.
Absolutely, and part of that is the demographic dividend story, or opportunity. So it's again kind of picking up on the demographic pressure and the aging pressure that a lot of countries are facing, with the opportunity and the youth. And India is still a younger population, and part of that story, it's a small decrease from 2023. It was over 7% into, as you said, now, but still, among the most robust. And part of that is by their increasing labor force participation, which is, driven by youth, higher productivity, as well as that is fueling more people with sort of money in their pockets, continues to fuel, household demand, domestic demand, and consumption. And so, there's other things that are associated with that. And, it's interesting because what that means is that it's also, I think, having an effect on India's role, not only within what some refer to as the global south, but its role kind of more broadly, and how people are thinking about India as a potential kind of partner, and how its role in the world vis-a-vis China and the region, and again, more globally and more broadly. So I think it's definitely, a story that is worth telling and worth watching, and sort of going from there. And yeah, I mean, I sort of, just echo, understandably, the comments of Martin, but, certainly that the size of the population in the developing world certainly warrants, I think, further attention. And again, to Hung's point, borderless. Economies are borderless in many respects.
Nicole, thank you. So, Martin, Hung, a final question to you both before I open it up. We've spent very little time, which is strange for us, talking about monetary policy. We mentioned inflation, and inflation coming down broadly, and the WEO, of course, points out, and Tobias has pointed out today, the sticky last mile and being wary of that. But what about divergent monetary policy paths? The Fed keeping interest rates higher for longer, the spillovers of that, versus the ECB looking like it will start easing probably by June. So the impacts of that divergent monetary policy. Martin, let me start with you.
Yeah, they acknowledge it, as I mentioned in my first contribution, I think. The consequence of longer elevated interest rates in the US and weaker rates in Europe, if it happens, and the UK, for example, will be that the exchange rate will give. And the question is, well, does it do that in a very rapid way? Is there going to be some kind of shock adjustment, which would cause some, problems in financial markets? I don't believe that. Markets are sophisticated enough, I think, to accommodate these kind of movements. But yeah, it's going to put some pressure on the US, because the exchange rate will favor then European exporters and the like, not to talk about China. So it may feed into this kind of sense that, oh, we have to do something to defend the US industry, which would be unfortunate. But it's just a normal range of things, as I mentioned in our preview of the annual meetings 2 days ago. The worst thing you could do is to not act central banks in accordance with their mandate.
By the way, there's multiple references to fixed mortgages, 30-year fixed mortgages, the WEO. So if you locked in at 2%, you are the reason monetary policy is not being transmitted according to previous projections. That is the message I took from the WEO. That is the problem in the U.S., that monetary policy is not transmitting the way they might have intended. Hung, the monetary policy question to you. They mentioned that several times, and then we'll open it up.
Right.
Yeah.
Quickly, price spot. You mentioned India, and correct, India has been revised upward 6.8% going forever. Good. However, the footprint of India on the global economy is tiny. It is a very self-contained, very restricted economy, and therefore 6.8% India has very small impact compared with 6.8% of China in terms of stimulating global growth, particularly from the emerging markets exporting commodities. So that should be kept in mind. But more importantly, it's not just an India story. It is also a story of the large emerging market countries, the Brazil of this world, the Indonesia of this world, the Morocco, and so on and so forth. So altogether, the WEO pointed out that the emerging market members of the G20 now has as much influence and impact and spill over on the global economy as all the advanced economies taken together. And it is the first time that we have this kind of balancing within the G20. And therefore, going forward, I think the G20 will be more of a level playing field where the emerging market countries can really push back against the so-called advanced countries.
Actually, yeah, if I may say, there's a very interesting, I believe it's a working paper that came out a couple of days ago by Gita Gopinath and Gorinchas and others about the changing nature of linkages, giving a much bigger weight on the feedback effects from those successful emerging markets back into developed economies.
I agree. We'll flag that to everyone here and online. It's really worth, if we were to make a reading list of things that are worth reading and the plethora of things that are put out, WEO blog, important. This paper from Gita Gopinath and Pierre Olivier on the weight of EMs and the spillover impact of EMs. I want to get to questions.
And the Great Reversal report.
The Great Reversal. We'll send a reading list around for the week. Okay, so tip your name card up if you'd like to jump in and have a question. We'll get to as many as we have. Gang.
Thanks, Josh. I'm Rogang Busari with the GeoEconomics Center. And we discussed earlier that this report feels like it's describing the global economy maybe in February, maybe March. And then since COVID, there's been a general sense that the WEO report is somewhat behind about what is happening right now just because there's so much happening in the global economy. And last week, the managing director, Georgieva, said in her ACF, in her curtain raiser at the council that, expect the unexpected. So in this world of expect the unexpected, how can the IMF do anything to keep the WEO relevant on the day it is published and does not feel outdated, the day after that it is published itself?
That's a great process question of how the WEO is produced. Martin, let me turn to you first on that, and then anyone else who wants to jump in.
So the WEO is an official IMF document. Now, who speaks for the IMF? In legal terms, it's the executive board of the IMF that speaks for the IMF. So that means in practice that the World Economic Outlook and its other flagship brethren have to be submitted to the IMF board, who then will have a discussion about it and usually require some changes and this and that, some adjustments. But only once that has taken place, it can be published. So that process just takes a couple of weeks because people need time to read things. And of course, the teams do their best to update the reports. But the fact is simply that they have to kind of finish it at a certain deadline that's way ahead of publication. So, I mean, that's a bit of a bureaucratic excuse. But also, I mean, don't expect that when you're writing this thing that you really can anticipate things that can happen like, weeks ahead of you. It's really supposed to take a bit of a stock of where is the economy. In fact, a big part of these reports is just simply taken up by describing what happened over the last 6 months or a year. So it's a bit like an ex-post report for the global economy. Here's what happened. And then we talk about, well, what do you think may happen going forward? Now, things like the Israel-Iran situation that they could not anticipate this year may sometimes have a dent, sometimes they don't. Certainly the one in Marrakesh was a big geopolitical event because it meant the opening of a new front in this proxy war between authoritarian states and the West. Similar, the banking crisis a year ago was quite a an important event because it signaled fragilities in the global banking system that needed to be addressed first before one could see whether they really had an impact for a longer time. So, you know, one has to take the WEO what it is. And people that write it, they put a lot of effort and thought into it. And I think it has a value that kind of goes beyond just, you know, the first couple of days once it's published. But it has its weaknesses, and that's simply that it's not like an investment bank report that can be adjusted with 1 day notice or two. It is really a massive undertaking where a lot of people work on it, and it has to be coordinated, and that takes time.
I have a very simple solution to the problem. Two things. One, the WEO and the GFSR should put upfront very clear cut-off date of data. So everyone that what we analyze now is based on the data as of like 3 weeks ago or 10 weeks ago. It is there, but unless you are a reader of WEO for 20 years, you cannot find it. It's very tiny footprint somewhere. Yeah? But bring it upfront to make sure that everyone understands it is the analysis as of this date. Number two, if I were the chief economist of the fund doing the press conference introducing the WEO, I would say, look, over the weekend we have this terrible thing happen, and that will change some of our forecasts, which the board has approved. So I can offer you some personal observation, not approved by the board, but my personal observation as chief economist to update the assessment. I think that he should be perfectly with his own right to do that.
Sure.
I never was the chief economist, so I wouldn't know.
I would love to see that press conference. That would get attention. But Jeremy, can I turn to you for a second on this? Because, okay, data lag is one thing. We all understand they got to put the thing to bed. It's got to go through a process. It's got to get approved. But what about data accuracy? I mean, there is a growing question here when it comes to China. And this is part, by the way, of the Articles Agreement and countries' responsibilities to the fund to provide accurate, transparent data to the fund. There's a reasonable question to ask whether that's happening with China right now.
Yeah, you have to be still in the building, I think, to get a clear sense of an answer to that. I've been gone for 4.5 years, and so, you know, you look at it from afar, and I think there are a lot of people who spend their lives analyzing the Chinese economy that question how it is that the IMF forecasts are always so close to the Chinese forecasts when others are looking at different types of data that feed into this and are coming up with generally lower numbers. I think, frankly, when it comes to a country like China, any institution that's making a forecast has its own set of interests that will constrain, in essence, the degree of I won't say honesty, but the degree of rigor that goes into the final number. You look at the investment banks and the brokerage houses, many of which have their own interests in China, and they will differ with the official Chinese numbers a bit, and then privately say, well, actually, we feel otherwise. And I think the same thing goes on with the IMF. Remember that China is the second largest shareholder. China has a significant voice at the table when the WEO or other reports about the Chinese economy are being discussed. And I think we are in an age in which, for various reasons, the folks who are crunching the numbers at the IMF are very cautious about taking stances with forecasts that might upset apple carts. We're talking about how the research department could maybe change how these numbers are presented. I think it has to do also with sort of the voice of the department, the people who talk. If you looked at yesterday's press conference, very, very cautious responses to questions on many countries. If asked about what about this country, what about that country, they simply read the growth forecast numbers and a couple of simple statements about the economy. And I think in the past there was a bit more freedom of movement at the institution to address questions like this. I think at the moment everybody's on a fairly tight rein, whether it's somebody's thrown it around them or whether they've attached it themselves, I don't know.
Just a quick side note, but just a little anecdote talking about China and data. Let's just remember last summer when youth unemployment was at peak levels, they stopped reporting it altogether and then came back, 6 months later with a new measure and a new metric. So just for what it's worth.
Remember that well. All right, we're almost out of time. I've promised to keep everything running on time to our events team today because we only have 7 more events this afternoon to get through, including South Africa's finance minister and Ireland's finance minister this afternoon. Ireland's finance minister here in the 5 o'clock hour, South Africa's finance minister at our IMF broadcast center at 3. But final question, we always end this way. I'll go down the line, starting with you, Martin. When we reconvene in October, the WEO that's produced 2 weeks before the election, upgrade or downgrade in the top line number?
I think it's going to go somewhat to the south.
Hung?
Unanimous.
Nicole?
With those guys.
Jeremy, you want to break the
sound of a thumb down.
four for 4, downgrade in
Something must be
October.
wrong here,
And
and
Josh?
we should be worried.
You know what I think? I think downgrade overall, but U.S. stable or higher in October for the pre-election edition of the
That's
WEO. So that's
actually-
my prediction.
Even more overheating.
Yeah.
Does
Overheated.
does this mean, since we're all down, that we can kind of discuss a different world economy next time?
Yeah, it can be whatever world economy you want to discuss in October. Thank you all for joining us for this 8th edition of Decoding the World Economic Outlook. Look forward to seeing everyone both here at the Council and at the IMF and online throughout our programming the rest of this week. Please join me in thanking our fellows.